The gavel was already in Judge Harrison Mitchell's hand. Room 412 of the New York County Courthouse was packed with 200 people, and every single one of them knew exactly how this was going to end. Bumpy Johnson, 20 years, no parole, no appeal, no mercy. The prosecution had said so. The defense had accepted it. Hell, even the newspapers waiting outside had already written the headlines. The only sound in that courtroom was the slow tick of the wall clock and the quiet shuffling of papers as lawyers prepared for the inevitable. But what none of those 200 people knew, what Judge Mitchell didn't know, was that 5 minutes before he'd taken his seat behind that bench, Bumpy Johnson had made one phone call, and that phone call was about to turn a rigged trial into the most shocking courtroom reversal in New York history. Because when Judge Harrison Mitchell raised that gavel, when he opened his mouth to deliver that 20-year sentence, the words that came out weren't the ones the prosecution had paid for. They weren't the ones every mobster in New York was expecting. They weren't even the ones the judge himself had planned to say. What happened in the next 60 seconds didn't just free Bumpy Johnson. It destroyed 3 of the most powerful families in New York, ended 2 political careers, and proved something that every man with power in that city would remember for the next 20 years. You never bet against Bumpy Johnson, especially when he's got nothing left to lose. November 18th, 1947. It had taken the prosecution 18 months to build their case against Bumpy Johnson. 18 months of wiretaps, surveillance, bribes, and intimidation. They'd turned 5 of his own men against him. They'd seized his bank records, raided his businesses, frozen his assets. District Attorney Thomas Dewey himself was personally overseeing the prosecution, because taking down Bumpy Johnson wasn't just about justice, it was about politics. Dewey was running for president. He'd already made his name prosecuting Lucky Luciano and Dutch Schultz. But Bumpy Johnson was different. Bumpy was the king of Harlem, the man who controlled the numbers racket that generated millions every week. Taking down Bumpy would prove that Dewey could handle organized crime, even the kind with black skin that most prosecutors preferred to ignore. The trial had lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of testimony about policy banks, illegal gambling, violence, extortion. The prosecution had witnesses, they had documents, they had recordings. Judge Harrison Mitchell, a 58-year-old federal appointee with 15 years on the bench, had already made it clear how this was going to go. Every objection from the defense was overruled. Every motion for dismissal was denied. Every witness for Bumpy was discredited or intimidated into silence. It was theater. Expensive, elaborate theater designed to look like justice while delivering a predetermined ending. But theater requires everyone to stick to the script, and nobody had given Bumpy Johnson a copy. On the morning of November 18th, as Judge Mitchell was having breakfast in his chambers, reviewing the sentencing guidelines that would put Bumpy away for 2 decades, his secretary knocked on the door. Phone call. "Your Honor," says it's urgent. Judge Mitchell almost didn't take it. He was busy. The trial was supposed to wrap up by noon, sentencing by 1 p.m. He had dinner plans with District Attorney Dewey that evening to celebrate, but something in his secretary's voice made him pick up the phone. "Your Honor, this is St. Mary's Hospital. There's been an accident." Judge Mitchell's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. He had 2 children, both grown, both living in Manhattan. His son David was 24, worked at a law firm downtown. His daughter Sarah was 22, married to a banker, living on the Upper West Side. "What kind of accident?" "Your son David, sir. He was struck by a car about an hour ago. He's in surgery now, but the doctors need to speak with family immediately." The coffee cup hit the floor, shattering. Judge Mitchell was out of his chambers in less than 30 seconds, black robes flowing behind him as he ran toward the elevator. He didn't think about the trial. He didn't think about Bumpy Johnson. He didn't think about anything except getting to that hospital and making sure his son was going to live. What Judge Mitchell didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that at the exact moment his secretary was handing him that phone, Bumpy Johnson was sitting in a holding cell 3 floors below, speaking quietly with his lawyer about a piece of information that had just changed everything. The information was this: David Mitchell, the judge's son, worked at Crane, Whitmore and Associates, a law firm that specialized in municipal bonds, and for the past 6 months, David Mitchell had been embezzling money from his clients. Not a lot, just enough to cover his gambling debts, debts that were owed to Joey Torino, a mid-level bookie who worked for the Lucchese family. Joey Torino had been getting pressure from his bosses. David Mitchell owed $8,000, and the kid couldn't pay. The Lucchese family didn't care that his father was a federal judge. They didn't care about anything except their money. And when Joey Torino was told to make an example of David Mitchell, to break his legs or worse, he knew exactly where to find him. Every Tuesday morning at 8 a.m., David Mitchell walked from his apartment on East 42nd Street to his office on Park Avenue. Same route, same timing, same corner where he stopped to buy coffee and read the morning paper. Joey Torino had been watching him for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. That right moment was supposed to be November 18, 1947, at 8:17 a.m., right in front of Brennan's coffee shop. Joey was going to step out of the alley, break David Mitchell's kneecaps with a lead pipe, and send a message that debts to the Lucchese family weren't suggestions. But at 8:15 a.m., as Joey Torino was checking his watch and gripping that lead pipe, David Mitchell never appeared. Instead, a man in an expensive gray suit approached Joey from behind and said 5 words that made Joey's blood run cold. "Mr. Torino, we need to talk." The man was Calvin Sweet Williams, Bumpy Johnson's most trusted associate. And Sweet Williams had a proposition that Joey couldn't refuse, not because he was scared of Bumpy Johnson, though he should have been, but because what Sweet was offering was worth more than David Mitchell's broken legs, more than $8,000, more than anything Joey had ever imagined. Sweet Williams offered Joey Torino a complete list of every corrupt police officer in the 23rd Precinct. Names, badge numbers, amounts of money they'd taken, crimes they'd covered up, information that would let the Lucchese family own half the cops in Manhattan. All Joey had to do was make one phone call to the hospital, report an accident that hadn't happened yet, get Judge Mitchell out of that courtroom for exactly 1 hour. Joey Torino made the call at 9:45 a.m. By 9:47 a.m., Judge Mitchell was racing toward St. Mary's Hospital, his mind focused on nothing but his son's survival. And by 9:50 a.m., Joey was following David Mitchell into the subway station at 42nd Street, where instead of breaking his legs, Joey was going to save his life, because there actually was going to be an accident. Just not the kind Judge Mitchell was imagining. At 10:15 a.m., as Judge Mitchell burst through the doors of St. Mary's Hospital emergency room, demanding to know where his son was, the desk nurse looked at him with confusion. "David Mitchell? No, sir. We don't have anyone here by that name. No accidents reported this morning involving anyone with that name." Judge Mitchell stared at her, his heart hammering. "But I received a call. You said there was an accident." The nurse checked her records again. "I'm sorry, sir. There's been no call from this hospital about a David Mitchell. Are you sure you got the name of the hospital right?" That's when Judge Mitchell's phone rang. Private number. He answered it with shaking hands. "Dad." "David? David, where are you? Are you hurt?" "I got a call saying you were in the hospital." "Dad, I'm fine. I'm at work. But Dad, something weird happened this morning. I was walking to the office, same route I always take, and this guy approached me. Big guy, black suit, said he was a friend of yours, said you'd sent him to give me a ride to work because there'd been some kind of threat." Judge Mitchell felt his legs give out. He sank into one of the hospital waiting room chairs. What threat? Who was this man? "I don't know, Dad, but he was very convincing. He knew my name. He knew where I worked. He knew my routine. He said there'd been a credible threat against federal judges' families and that you'd arranged for security. He showed me a badge, looked official, so I let him drive me to work." What Judge Mitchell didn't understand, what was only becoming clear as his son continued talking, was that the threat had been real. Joey Torino really had been planning to break David's legs that morning. The man in the black suit really was providing security, and Judge Mitchell really did owe someone his son's safety. He just didn't know who yet. "Dad, are you there?" The man said to tell you something. He said to tell you that Judge Anthony DeLuca sends his regards, and that the debt from 1943 has been paid in full. Judge Mitchell dropped the phone. Judge Anthony DeLuca. He hadn't heard that name in 4 years, but he remembered everything. October 1943. Judge DeLuca had been presiding over a racketeering trial, ready to sentence 5 members of the Genovese family to 20 years each. But the night before sentencing, Judge DeLuca's daughter had been kidnapped. The kidnappers demanded he throw out the case or they'd kill her. Judge DeLuca had called Judge Mitchell, desperate, terrified. They'd been friends since law school, colleagues for 15 years. Mitchell had made some calls, used some connections, found someone who could help, someone who could track down the kidnappers and bring DeLuca's daughter home safely. That someone had been Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy had found those kidnappers in less than 12 hours. He'd returned Judge DeLuca's daughter unharmed, and he'd never asked for anything in return, never called in the favor, never mentioned it again, until now. As Judge Mitchell sat in that hospital waiting room, understanding slowly dawning, his bailiff was calling his chambers. "Your Honor, the courtroom is packed. Everyone's waiting for you to return. Should we proceed with sentencing?" Judge Mitchell looked at his watch, 10:45 a.m. He'd been gone for exactly 1 hour. 1 hour during which his son's life had been saved by the same man who was sitting in a courtroom 3 miles away, waiting to be sentenced to 20 years in prison. Judge Mitchell closed his eyes. He thought about justice. He thought about the law. He thought about the $15,000 that District Attorney Dewey had quietly deposited into his son David's bank account 2 weeks ago, payment for ensuring that Bumpy Johnson never walked free again. But mostly, he thought about his son walking to work that morning, unaware that death was waiting for him in an alley, saved by a man who owed him nothing and asked for nothing in return. Judge Mitchell stood up, straightened his robes, and walked toward the door. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he told his bailiff, "and I want the courtroom cleared of everyone except the prosecution, the defense, and the defendant." Bumpy Johnson was standing in that courtroom when Judge Mitchell walked back in at 11:10 a.m. Bumpy was wearing the same black suit he'd worn for 3 weeks, the same calm expression, the same steady gaze that had never wavered, not once, during the entire trial. He looked like a man who'd made peace with his fate. But as Judge Mitchell took his seat behind the bench, as he looked down at Bumpy Johnson and prepared to speak, Bumpy did something unexpected. He smiled, not a smug smile, not a threatening smile, a knowing smile. The smile of a man who just proved that honor meant more than money, that loyalty was stronger than law, that sometimes the right thing and the legal thing were two completely different animals. Judge Mitchell picked up his gavel. The courtroom was dead silent. District Attorney Dewey was leaning forward in his seat, confident, expectant. The defense attorney was staring at his shoes, resigned to defeat. "Mr. Johnson," Judge Mitchell said, his voice steady but quiet, "you've been found guilty of operating an illegal gambling enterprise, conspiracy to commit extortion, and racketeering. The prosecution has asked for a 20-year sentence. The defense has asked for leniency." Bumpy Johnson stood straighter, hands clasped behind his back, ready to hear his fate. "However," Judge Mitchell continued, "I find myself compelled to consider evidence that was not presented during this trial, evidence that speaks to your character, your sense of honor, and your commitment to protecting innocent people from harm." District Attorney Dewey's head snapped up. His mouth opened to object, but Judge Mitchell silenced him with a look. "Evidence that suggests that while you may have broken the law, you have not broken faith with the principles that make a man worthy of a second chance." Judge Mitchell raised the gavel. "Bumpy Johnson, this court sentences you to time served, plus 2 years probation. You are free to go." The gavel came down. District Attorney Dewey shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. The prosecution demands an explanation. This sentence is completely inappropriate, given the severity of the crimes." Judge Mitchell looked at him with ice-cold eyes. "Mr. Dewey, your prosecution was based on evidence obtained through illegal wiretaps, coerced testimony, and witness intimidation. Upon further review, this court finds that the entire case should have been dismissed due to prosecutorial misconduct. Mr. Johnson is lucky to receive any sentence at all, considering that most of the evidence against him was inadmissible. That was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it. But it was the kind of lie that sounded official enough, legal enough, that no one could challenge it without opening a much larger can of worms. Bumpy Johnson walked out of room 412 at 11:23 a.m. on November 18, 1947. As he stepped through those courthouse doors into the November sunlight, his lawyer grabbed his arm. "Bumpy, what the hell just happened in there? How did you know the judge was going to change his mind?" Bumpy lit a cigarette, took a long drag, and looked back at the courthouse. "Some debts take 4 years to come due," he said quietly, "but they always come due." What the lawyer didn't understand, what District Attorney Dewey never figured out, what Judge Mitchell never spoke about, was that Bumpy Johnson had known about David Mitchell's gambling problem for 6 months. He'd known about the threats from the Lucchese family. He'd known about Joey Torino's plan to break the kid's legs. And most importantly, he'd known that saving Judge Mitchell's son would remind the judge of who Bumpy Johnson really was. Not the monster the prosecution had painted, not the criminal the newspapers described, but a man who protected people when they needed protection. A man who honored debts even when nobody was watching. Bumpy Johnson never spoke to Judge Mitchell again, never called in another favor, never mentioned what had happened that morning. But Judge Harrison Mitchell never forgot, and for the rest of his 20-year career on the federal bench, whenever he saw a case involving someone from Harlem, someone the system wanted to crush simply because they were black, poor, or powerless, Judge Mitchell remembered the man who had saved his son and asked for nothing in return. District Attorney Thomas Dewey lost the 1948 presidential election to Harry Truman by the narrowest margin in history. Some political analysts said it was because voters didn't trust a prosecutor who could build an airtight case against a notorious criminal and then watch him walk free. Dewey never knew how right they were. Bumpy Johnson walked out of that courthouse and went back to Harlem, back to his empire, back to his life. But something had changed that day, something deeper than legal victory, something more important than avoiding prison. Bumpy Johnson had proved that power wasn't just about fear, wasn't just about money, wasn't just about violence. Real power was about understanding that every person, no matter how high their position, no matter how untouchable they seemed, had someone they loved. And if you protected what they loved, if you honored what they valued, if you proved that your word meant more than your weapon, you could change hearts as well as minds. Judge Harrison Mitchell died in 1962. 15 years after that trial. His obituary in the New York Times mentioned his distinguished career, his commitment to justice, his reputation for fairness, but it didn't mention the phone call that changed his life, the debt that shaped his conscience, or the man who taught him that sometimes mercy was stronger than law. David Mitchell, the judge's son, never learned the full truth about what happened that morning. He thought he'd been protected by federal security, never knowing that his guardian angel was the same man his father was supposed to send to prison. David became a judge himself in 1965, following in his father's footsteps, and those who knew him said he had an unusual sympathy for defendants from Harlem, an uncommon willingness to consider the humanity behind the crime. That's Bumpy Johnson's real legacy. Not the money, not the power, not the fear he inspired, but the lives he touched, the debts he honored, the moments when he chose to save instead of destroy, the phone call that lasted 60 seconds but changed 2 families forever. The gavel came down that day in 1947, but the echo is still reverberating, because sometimes justice isn't about what the law demands. Sometimes it's about what honor requires, and sometimes the most powerful man in the room is the one who understands the difference.